Why do some messages stick, spread, and persuade while others get ignored almost instantly? The answer lies less with logic than most leaders think. Today, leaders aren't just competing on strategy, they're competing for attention, belief, and action. Understanding the behavioral science behind how people think and decide can be the difference between messages that get ignored and ideas that actually move people. In this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast, I'm once again joined by Nancy Harhut, the author of the book, Using Behavioral Science in Marketing. We're here to unpack the hidden psychological forces that shape attention, memory, and decision making. We explore why stories are so powerful, what accidental invention of the post it notes reveals about reframing failure, why one standout experience like the Magic Castle's popsicle hotline can make an ordinary brand unforgettable, and how service stories like the Grand Hyatt teddy bear story can become culture defining moments inside any organization. If you want to become a persuasive leader, marketer, communicator, or decision maker, this conversation is packed with practical insights that you can use immediately. Here's my conversation with Nancy. Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we explore the stories, strategies, and insights of thought leaders who inspire us to think differently and lead better. Through candid conversations and expert perspectives, we dive into the challenges, breakthroughs, and practical lessons that shape exceptional leadership. How can brands structure their social proof to feel credible, specific, and believable? Because this is becoming more and more of a problem. You just don't know what's real. And I would argue that as AI gets better, it's going to be really hard to tell.
Yeah, you're not wrong about that. You are not wrong about that. A couple of things. One is specifics outpull generalities, right? So the more specific we can be, as opposed to vague, the more concrete language we can use, as opposed to something that's more abstract, the better off we're going to be. So if we're talking about reviews and social proof, we want the ones that have that very specific language. As I also just mentioned, the ones that maybe expressed a little bit of skepticism ahead of time, that resonates too, because those are the ones that sound really human. They're the ones that don't sound like they're AI generated, because there's like specific detail and there's somebody's individual story. And maybe there's even somebody's hesitation or doubt that was initially present. And that's a great way to make sure that your testimonials and the social proof bits that you're using are gonna resonate. The other interesting thing is a lot of times we're like, when we ask people to rank our products or rate our products, I should say, we say, hey, give us a 5-star review if you've been happy. We think, well, we're asking for 5 stars, but only if they've been happy, but we're pushing for that 5 stars. And there was a study that came out of Northwestern University that found that the optimum number of stars isn't 5. It's somewhere between 4.2 and 4.7, because basically what you're saying is, look, you can't please all the people all the time. If you're up there in those 4s, it means you're doing pretty good. If you have nothing but 5-star reviews, people think it's only bots. It's, the marketer is paying for the reviews, or marketer is pulling down the bad ones. And so, we don't have to be perfect. We don't have to present this perfect, pristine, beautifully polished picture. Like, it's okay that not everybody loves us. It's okay that somebody wasn't sure that we would be the right choice. The more authentic, the more real we can be, the better it is for us as marketers.
You're right. It definitely boosts credibility a whole lot more that way than it is in the way you just mentioned with everything being perfect. So, looking at the post it notes origin story, a failed strong adhesive that becomes a breakthrough office staple. What should leaders learn about how to talk about happy accidents and pivots inside their own companies?
I mean, that's a great example. I mean, stories are memorable. They're inviting. We can rattle off the features and benefits and the facts and figures, and they go in one ear and out the other. Even if people want to remember them, they just don't. But stories, they stick in our minds, which is great. And the a post-it note was a great example. They were trying to invent something else. They failed. They failed, and yet they ended up inventing the post-it note. Right? It did not accomplish what they set out to do, but yet it turned out to serve this very important need. And it makes me think of a behavioral science principle called the pratfall effect, which is it's okay to admit a shortcoming. If people actually find you to be more credible if you say, hey, listen, like with their story, they're like, we know you love the product. Let us tell you how we invented it. It was kind of by accident. It doesn't take away from the fact that the product still works really well for its intended use. It doesn't, in any way damage the reputation of the company. We all love, 3M and their post-it notes, but by kind of acknowledging we didn't really set out to invent this, it was kind of a mistake or a happy coincidence, frame it however you want. But there's the truthfulness, the authenticity, and the willingness to say, we're not perfect. Those are the stories that are memorable, that are believable, and that build brand preference because you remember the story and you also think more favorably about the brand because they admitted it. They admitted, hey, it was a happy accident, but now look how great the product is. And what's cool about that is now when you're using it, you feel like you know the inside story. You're part of that little community. And the next time you recommend it to someone, you might want to bring it up and pass the story on. And then it starts to go viral, if you will, like it takes on a life of its own.
You're right. And that story has all the elements of a great narrative: a failed attempt, a surprising twist, a problem discovered, and an everyday solution we can all picture. It turns a dry R&D tale into a memorable human story about curiosity and persistence. And leaders can use that pattern to reframe their own pivots and experiments as stories of discovery rather than mistakes. I've seen that time and time again. So instead of, like you said, hiding failures, they talk about them as a setup for the value their customers now enjoy, which is not only makes the brand more interesting, but also signals a culture that learns and adapts, which is something that a lot of buyers can respect.
Absolutely. There's an addendum to that, even that there's something that behavioral scientists call the labor illusion. And it's this idea that the amount of time or effort that go into something, it becomes an indication or a proxy of its quality. So, you don't always have to get it right on the first try. In fact, maybe saying that it took you 5 tries before you finally perfected the ingredients or the product. People think like, oh, wow, it must be good. It took them 5 times before they got it right, and it actually elevates the value of that product or that brand in someone's mind because of all the effort that went into it.
Great insight there. And you mentioned also that a fact in a story is 22 times more memorable. So hopefully we've convinced our audience that you got to get better at storytelling. You got to be better with your narrative arcs and use them more frequently in all aspects of leadership. You have another great example in the book of the Magic Castle Hotels Popsicle Hotline that shows how one vivid gesture can turn a fairly ordinary hotel into a legendary experience. What does that teach to executives about the von Restorff effect, creating one memorable, talk-worthy moment rather than trying to be great at everything?
Sure. So the von Restorff effect is the idea that things that stand out from their surroundings get noticed and remembered, right? So, and this goes way back to our ancient ancestors. You'd get up in the morning, we'd stick our head out of the cave, we'd scan the horizon. If everything looked the way it did the day before, that was a good thing. But if something new had been introduced to the environment or something had been removed from the environment, that could present a threat. And in those days, it was a very real threat. It could be a life or death threat. And all these years later, it's still hardwired into us to notice things that are different from their surroundings. And so you've got a bunch of different hotels out there, and they all have beds in the rooms and lobbies and maybe pools in the back. And but they're fairly interchangeable, but all of a sudden there's this one hotel that comes along and they have this service where you can pick up a phone and immediately request an ice pop. And who else is doing that? So now suddenly that's the one thing that people remember because it stands out from all the other hotels and people are focused on it. And then there's the novelty of it. It's like, oh, wow, I've never been to a hotel that does that before. And then there's the, well, I want to experience it for myself factor. So I have to stay there. And then you just remember it, right? You remember it is I need to go to a hotel. What was the one that did the popsicle? So from a marketing perspective, instead of trying to be everything to everyone, instead of trying to list every possible feature or benefit that our product or service embodies, we want to just zero in on that one thing that makes us different, that makes us sets us apart from everyone else that's out there because that's what gets remembered. And with it, that brings business and then someone can experience all of the features and benefits that we offer.
Love that. Another great story that you mentioned for service organizations, the Grand Hyatt teddy bear story. Finding a child's forgotten bear and sending photos of it enjoying an extended vacation before returning it has clearly traveled far beyond the original guest. How do you recommend leaders uncover, codify, and scale these kinds of service stories inside their organizations? Because some do it amazingly well, like the Ritz Carlton, but other ones really struggle at this.
Yeah, no, and that is a great question. And it has to be institutionalized because you might have various employees running around doing these incredible things, but if no one else knows about it, you don't as a entity have the opportunity to capitalize on it. And so, it could be as simple as, setting up a program saying, every week you send out an email and ask your employees, did anyone go above and beyond? Does anyone have a great story? Just to remind them and, and capturing that and having someone whose responsibility it is to review these and then grab the ones that are going to have legs, if you will, and start to disseminate them and start to use them in the marketing or start to send them out to customer service. But it needs to come from the top. And like anything, sure, everyone's going to agree it's a great idea, and then we all get busy and we forget. So we need to, have a process in place to capture it and to occasionally remind people about that process. And you don't need one a week, one a month, even one a quarter. One a year can get, give you a ton of mileage. But you need to be able to uncover them, and the only way to uncover them is to remind people that this is what you guys stand for. This is what we as a company stand for, and periodically ask for examples and make sure that they end up in a place that's accessible and usable.
I've seen it often starts too with just leaders can uncover these stories by consistently asking frontline teams for examples of times they went above and beyond. Then sharing those stories internally as model stimulate, like you mentioned, codify them through training, playbooks, or internal awards, turns these one off heroics into part of the company's identity, making it more likely that similar moments will happen again and that customers will leave with stories worth sharing, which is what all customers and rather companies want. So stories shape how people see themselves and how your brand will impact their lives, which leads into these next behavior principles, and that's labeling and framing. The words that you use to describe your customers and your products and your value, they matter. So let's first talk about labeling. Once people are labeled as part of a group, they often act consistently with that label.
Sure. So, you could label somebody a forward-thinking CEO. You could label them a savvy decision maker. You could even say, you're not the kind of person that always follows the crowd. You're not afraid to think for yourself. You're an independent thinker, right? Now, if you're a challenger brand and you start out by labeling somebody an independent thinker, that would be a great thing to do, because if you're not an independent thinker, you're going to go with the market leader. It's safe, right? And if you represent a challenger brand, that means you're going to lose that person's business. But if you say to that person, you're an independent thinker, you're not afraid to buck the crowd, you recognize a good idea when you see it. So those are all ways to label somebody in a way that's consistent with what you're going to ask them to do, which is to choose you, the challenger brand. There was a study that was done in Chicago where they asked people about an upcoming election and asked them a bunch of questions about the candidates and the questions on the ballot. And then they took the answers and pushed them off to the side and did nothing with them, but they randomly put people into two groups. And they went to one group and said, you guys are the more politically active. And then they watched to see what would happen on election day. And 15% more of those people actually went to the polls and voted. And why? Because, well, what would a politically active person do? They would vote on election day, wouldn't they? But Charles, you might say to me, well, it was only 15%. It wasn't 100%. And you're right. We have yet to get to the point where we can wave a magic wand and make 100% of the people do 100% of what we want 100% of the time. But with a small change in language, like you're saying, with just that right labeling phrase, if you could pick up a 15% increase in sales, it would be worth it, right? So it's like what you want to do is you want to think about what you're going to ask someone to do and then label them in such a way that it just makes perfect sense that they would do it. The label would lead very nicely into what you're asking them to do.
This is so critical to understand because as soon as you were told that you're part of a group, then you begin acting in ways that are more consistent with members of that group. The label influences your perception of yourself and your resulting behavior, which is powerful. Let's now switch the frame to framing. So, framing the same offer as an investment instead of a cost, or 95% fat free instead of 5% fat, changes behavior significantly in most cases. How should executives think about reframing their core value proposition without feeling like they're spinning it or misleading their prospect?
Well, it goes back to what we're saying about, being truthful, right? We don't want to lie. We want to be truthful. And so, you have your value proposition, but then what you want to do is you want to think about where your value proposition intersects with your audience's needs. You gave the example of 95% fat free versus 5% fat. If your audience is trying to lose weight and eat healthy, they're looking for 95% fat free, right? They're not looking for how much, ooh, this one has 5% fat. That's going to be distasteful to them. Fat free is going to play very nicely. The product is what the product is. It is 95% fat free or 5% fat by you do the math. If it's 95% fat free, the other 5% is fat. So you're not lying. You're just framing it based on, what your audience is looking for. And I think that's the thing. You want to find that intersection between what you offer and what your audience is seeking, and then you create the frame. Sometimes, sometimes framing helps you just emphasize almost emphasize the obvious. There was a behavioral science study where a company was going to introduce a $5 shipping charge. So $5 is $5. We all know how much $5 is worth, right? But they tested a small $5 fee against a $5 fee. And you could argue that adding small in front of it would insult the reader's intelligence because they know how much $5 is. You could argue that it takes up more space on the call to action. You could even argue that, you don't want to insult people by, making the value judgment that it's small. And yet, when they did that, they got a 20% increase in sales. And what it did, the idea of adding small, was it just made it more top of mind that it was only $5. So sometimes framing is a technique to help you really emphasize what you want people to concentrate on, what you want them to notice in the message.
When you can even test framing your product in terms of the experience that the customers will have with it versus the money they'll save on it or with it, because the experiencing a product can foster that emotional response that we talked about earlier. And using framing to get people to see things in a new way or in the marketer's preferred way is very advantageous and can be very profitable in the end for the company as well.
Absolutely. I mean, we can talk about framing things in terms of price or framing things in terms of time and experience with the product. And when you frame things in terms of price, it focuses people on the price. So if you've got a great price story to tell, okay, fantastic. But if you're trying to kind of make price not a mitigating factor, emphasize the time and experience you're going to have with something. There was a study that was done with a lemonade stand, interestingly enough, and they had three different signs. One sign said, spend a little time and enjoy some lemonade. Another one said, spend a little money and enjoy some lemonade. And the third one simply said, enjoy some lemonade. People stopped more often when it said, spend a little time. They were allowed to buy a glass on a sliding scale. They paid more for the glass when it said, spend a little time. And they reported being more satisfied. So by focusing people not on the money they were spending, but on the experience they were having, it just made them all around happier customers and more satisfied customers. It didn't change what the product was. It just allowed the marketer to highlight one aspect over another.
Love that. Well, time is another frame you emphasize, not just what you say, but when you say it through temporal landmarks and the fresh start effects, where people are more open to change at beginnings, not just beginnings of the year, which we're approaching, but birthdays, job changes, the beginning of certain seasons. How can marketing and sales leaders operationalize this idea in their calendars and campaigns rather than treating it as just a one off New Year's push?
Sure. So, I mean, New Year's is absolutely the granddaddy, the biggest of these, because, everyone says, oh, I'm going to stop smoking on New Year's Day. They don't say they're going to stop on December 14th, right? No one says, oh, yeah, December 14th. It's like, no, and January 1st, right? So it's this idea that there are just times in our lives when we think of like our old self and our new self. This is old Nancy with all the things she failed to accomplish. And now I'm opening the door to new Nancy, fresh start, clean page. And I feel energized and I feel confident that I'm going to accomplish my goals. And so as a result, that's when a marketer wants to grab you, because if you're feeling energized and confident, you're more open to choosing a new vendor, trying a new product, embarking on a new initiative. So the beginning of the year is great. The beginning of a month also works. That's another temporal landmark. The beginning of a season, of a quarter, of a fiscal year, the beginning of the week, Mondays, right? Again, I didn't get it done last week, but this week, I'm sure I'm going to accomplish what I want to, right? We all feel like we're starting fresh at the beginning of the weeks. Um, we can bring it all the way down to, starting with the big one, the beginning of the year, but every week, right? 52 weeks a year, every week we have an opportunity to pick up that fresh start effect. And then people's birthdays, their anniversaries, when they start a new job, when they get promoted into a new position, when they buy a new house. These are all, examples of times when you could argue people are in play and they're starting fresh. And because of that, because they're starting fresh, because they're in play, they're more open to new vendor relationships, trying new products.
However, there are times, though, when there's this human tendency to separate ourselves between our present self and our future self. And it's in those times, right? It's important for the marketer to help customers envision themselves in the future as being very much like the person they are in the present. Being able to do this well will help the marketer overcome this concept called temporal discounting.
Yeah, it's the scientific research on this is fascinating. What behavioral scientists have found is our future selves are like strangers to us. We have no idea who they are, how they're going to behave. There have been a number of experiments where people are offered $100 now or $110 next week. And most people grab the $100 now, right? They want the money in their hands now. And then a week passes and they're like, ah, I should have waited. I could have had $110. If you're in business, if you're in marketing and you're selling donuts or beer or, pizzas or something that's, you're going to consume it right away. You're going to enjoy that, that instant gratification. You're golden, no problem. But if you're selling anything where the benefit comes later, people discount it. So if you're selling diet pills, exercise equipment, insurance, saving for retirement, education, right? Anything where by definition, the payoff is going to be later, we have to overcome present focus bias. So it's trying to build that bridge between who you are today and who you're going to be in the future. It's the same person you are today, the same likes and needs and wants and preferences and goals, but in the future. One company, it was a financial services company, and they did a face retirement campaign where you could upload a photo of yourself and age progress it so that you could see what you look like 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years down the road. I tried it. It wasn't pretty, believe me. And then, they said, hey, would you like more information about saving for retirement? And I think over 1 million people opted in and said, yeah, send me the additional information because it just made it, more salient. You're more aware of who you were going to be as you aged and what you might need.
Great examples. Love that. So once timing is aligned, you'll need to get their attention. And that's where information gaps and curiosity comes in. You talk about information gap theory. If people sense a gap between what they know and what they want to know, they'll actively act to close it. How can leaders use this when crafting subject lines, titles, or thought provoking leadership topics? We face this all the time in the leadership development industry to say, what can we do to really make them understand here's this gap and get them curious and want to close it?
What I always recommend to my clients is you rely on the 5 W's and the 1 H: who, what, where, when, why, and how. And if you can start your headline, your subject line, your content title, the name of your webinar, the name of your white paper, whatever your resource is, but start it with that. That nicely tees up the information gap. Who's going to be named this year's marketing leader? What's the best way for accountants to trim expenses? Why are more and more pharmacists turning to XYZ company, right? You're like, okay, well, I'm a pharmacist or I'm an accountant or I'm in marketing, I'm interested in this topic, but I don't know what the answer is. And so as a result, I'm much more likely to take the action to get the answer, whether that is to click on the email or to download the ebook or to sign up for the webinar. It creates that gap between what you know and what you want to know. I know a little bit, I know a lot even about, marketing or pharma or accounting, but I don't know the answer to this specific question. The other thing you can do is you can use superlatives, right? The best, the worst, the most, the least, the most requested. The worst thing you can do when you're applying for a loan: the most requested flavor at this ice cream store. I'm here to order ice cream. I wonder what the most requested one is. I'm going to be taking out a loan. What's the worst thing I can do, right? That also creates that information gap that people then want to close and will take the action to seek the information to close that gap.
I see this a lot with a lot of programs where they just give them the answers. They don't create questions to make them curious, to help them to stay engaged. It's just here's one answer after another. And it's not an effective way to keep engagement over long trainings or educational programs. It's much better just to tease it out in pieces and to get them curious about the question before you give them the answers, which, in my opinion, if I saw that more frequently done, you'd have a much more engaged audience.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Charles. There's research that came out of BI Norwegian School of Business that found that questions outperform declarative sentences by up to 140%. So it supports your theory. Yeah, questions keep people engaged.
Great. Well, of course, once you've earned that click, you have to present choices and paths in a way that help people move forward instead of freezing up. And that's where choice architecture really comes in. So for companies proud of their wide selection, how do you help them reconcile that pride with the data that fewer clear choices actually sell more?
Yeah, no, people love all the choices, but then that analysis paralysis sets in and they just can't decide, or they make a choice, but they keep thinking, I might have left something better on the table. So limiting choices is good. And I know some companies are like, but we have so much we want to say. So what you do is you start to subdivide. So maybe you're a candy company. So first question is, what do you want, hard candy or chocolate? I want chocolate. Okay, great. So you gave people two choices. They made a choice between the two. Now they're in the chocolate category. Now, well, do you want white chocolate, dark chocolate, or milk chocolate? Oh, actually, I would like milk chocolate. Awesome, great. Now you want milk chocolate. Do you want Belgian chocolate? Do you want Dutch chocolate, or do you want English chocolate? So you start to subdivide. So people start to work their way down the decision tree, but they're never asked to make a choice between, or for more than like, with more than three different options, So it moves along quickly, it's easy, and you can get to where you want to get to. And it allows the company to showcase their breadth of products, but also to make sure that they're guiding, that they're serving up, I should say, the product that the prospective customer is most interested in. Two is, in my book, two is always better than one, because you have one thing, you're like, I don't know, do I or do I not want this? Two things, it's like, oh, which of these two do I want? Two is always better than one. And the research proves you're almost four times as likely to make a decision if you have two choices versus one. Three is always great because three is a magic number. More often than not, people go for that center option. So as marketers, we can construct our three choices to make the center option the most desirable one for us. But, I wouldn't go beyond four or five before I would start to do exactly what I described, kind of subcategorize. All right, make this first choice, then we'll make another choice, then we can make yet a third choice. But much better than putting, nine things in front of someone and saying, which of these do you want?
Exactly. And I've seen this a lot too. Another guest on the podcast said that for people to choose a new product over the product they're currently using, it doesn't have to be a little bit better. It has to be 9.8 times better because people have this status quo bias. They just are consistent with their previous choices. What can new products or disruptors coming into the space do to overcome this?
Yeah, that it is. It's a very good point about status quo bias. Sometimes we think our biggest competition is our competitor, and it's not. It's inertia. It just feels comfortable to not do anything, and so we need to shake people up to kind of get them to just step out of their shell and out of their routine and do something different, or we need to make it easier for them to do what we want them to do. So, for example, we were doing some work with a insurance company, and they would go into different employment places, different companies, and they would offer employees the opportunity to sign up for an appointment and learn about these different kinds of voluntary insurance that they could buy. And very few people would sign up, right? HR would send out an email saying, hey, Acme Insurance is going to be here. Make your appointment. You can learn all about these policies that you can buy. And if you want, you can buy one. And, crickets, no one signs up. So we went in and we said, all right, we're going to have HR send out an email that tells you when your meeting is. Charles, we set up a meeting for you. It's on Tuesday at 3 o'clock in room 14. Um, See you there. We took the liberty of setting it up because it's so important. And then in a smaller, section, it said, if you need to reschedule, click this link. And what happened was way more people showed up to the meeting because it was easier, right? That the path of least resistance was to go to the meeting, right? And if we're trying to overcome inertia, we want to make the path of least resistance lead to our door, right? In the first case, I had to schedule the appointment. It was up to me. I had to do all the work. In the second case, it was work to get out of the appointment. It had already been set up for me. It was easier to just go to it. And they ended up with 418% more people at the meetings, and they got 19% more of them actually buying insurance. So it really accomplished what they were trying to do. And what they did is they kind of overcame inertia by making it easier for people to do what they wanted them to do, right? So you want to make it a little bit harder for people to do what you don't want them to do and easier for them to do what you do want them to do.
Common sense, but not common practice, I would argue. And underpinning all these techniques is language, the actual words and phrases you choose. So let's talk about that because it's often the fastest thing leaders can change. You emphasize that fluent, concrete language and devices like alliteration, power words, and the WIFM are really great to keep the copy brain friendly.
So what I see a lot of right now is vague versus concrete language and an overuse of acronyms and jargon and text speak. So concrete versus vague. Research shows that if you use concrete language, you make more sales. There was a study at an e-commerce site, and for a period of 9 months, they used more concrete language over less specific, more abstract language, and they got a 30% increase in sales. So a common example was, you could have pants or you could have blue jeans. Well, pants is not as concrete. Blue jeans is more concrete. If I said, "Oh, would you like these pants? Are they jeans? Are they corduroys? Are they khakis? Are they dress pants?" I don't know. If I say blue jeans, you get a mental picture, right? They're blue jeans. You can see it. And if we can create the mental picture, we're much more likely to act on it. So I think one of the biggest mistakes we're making is we're not using enough concrete language. Everybody sells a solution to optimize your email. Well, all right, are you going to help me send the email? Are you going to help me write the email? Are you going to help me construct how are you going to optimize my email? What exactly does your solution do? And Time and time again, you'll go to somebody's webpage and you're still not sure what it is they offer, right? So specificity, right? Concrete language. And then the second thing is downplay the acronyms and the jargon and the tech speak. We think that we need to use this. We think that that's our price of entry. It proves that we play in this space. And what it does is it slows people down. It can confuse them. And when you create that kind of friction, when you slow people down, when you make them pause and think, sometimes you lose them. You know, they'd rather just go someplace else where it's easier. And there have been studies that show that even among highly educated people, so in your B2B audience, where you've got someone who's controlling, millions and millions of dollars in budget, and they're highly educated, and they've got a lot of experience in the field, even they prefer simple, easy to understand language. It just makes things easier for them. It reduces their cognitive load. It reduces the strain they have on their brain. And we've already got so much going on. We're already juggling so many different things that anytime a marketer can make things easier, they put themselves in a better place because of it. There was a study that was done with some doctoral candidates, and they were reading, doctoral thesis papers, right? And the researchers went in and they found every word that was 9 letters or longer. They took it out and they substituted a shorter synonym. And then some people read the original, some people read the versions with the shorter synonyms. People ranked the versions with the shortest synonyms as better papers, and they rated the authors as more intelligent. So that idea that we've got this very educated audience, we need to use these big words, it doesn't hold water. Even super smart people prefer simple, easy to understand language.
You're right. Scientists have found that people prefer things that feel easier to think about and easier to understand. Not only do they prefer them, people feel more confident in their ability to make decisions about them. And if something's hard to read, people will assume it's probably hard to do. So choose your words carefully because they're important. And you mentioned at the beginning of the podcast a few words to always try to use more of, which one of them we already talked about, which was imagine. The other two are free. And most importantly, I think, is you. When you describe a story, when you talk to people, use the second person. Imagine if you could do this, not we, not us, not our company. It puts them into the story. It makes them feel like this could benefit me.
You're absolutely right. And it's a common mistake that we make. We're big believers in our products and our services in our company, and we want to tell everyone about it. We're enthusiastic. It comes from the right place. But what happens is we, our company, our product, or the company name. And again, it comes from the right place. But behavioral science research shows that people are skimming and scanning, and their I doesn't stop at I, we, our, but it does stop at the word you and at their own name. So if you can use somebody's name, use it. But we can't always, and that's okay. Use the word you. Our I will stop there. You is a powerful word. As you said, so is imagine, so is the word free, so is the word because. When people are given a reason for what we're asking them to do, they're much more likely to do it. So because is another power word. And there's small changes, small edits we can make in our language, but they can have a really outsized impact.
One literary device or that people don't use enough of, especially leaders, is that when they're introducing a new product that people may or may not have a frame of reference for, or marketing a service that people might not have heard of, or it's hard for them to grasp, consider using similes and metaphors. It's so underutilized, but it's so effective because both are great ways to make comparisons between something they know and something you're trying to tell them that they need.
Sure, a simile is a comparison using the words like or as. A metaphor is a comparison without those words, but it's still a comparison. You're drawing a parallel between two different things. And when you're introducing a new product, or when you've got a more technical product that people may not fully understand, it's very helpful to use a simile or to use a metaphor because it makes that idea easier to grasp. There was a company called Crazy Egg, and they ran a headline that said, Crazy Egg is like having X-ray glasses for your website or something like that. I can't tell based on its name what that company does, but having X-ray glasses for my website, I understand what X-ray glasses are. So if Crazy Egg is like X-ray glasses for my website, it means I'm going to be able to see into the website. I'm going to be able to see what's not available, visible on the surface. I can go inside and see how things are operating. So similes are great. Metaphors are great. Even like reference brands, it's the Netflix for car racing, or it's the Netflix for marketing, or, like you pick a reference brand and then you peg your product or your company to it. And people are like, oh, I understand what that is. So, oh, okay. So this company is to this category as Netflix is to entertainment. So anytime we can do something like that to make our product or service easier for people to understand, it's a win for our customers and for our company.
I think we have time for one more principle. I'd love to sneak this in if we can, and that's the consistency principle and the Zeigarnik effect. And there's another effect associated with it as well. That once people start to say yes to something in a small way, that leads to a bigger yes down the road. Caldini covers this a lot, but talk to me how companies and leaders can do this more effectively and leverage this behavior science principle.
So the idea is once you say yes once, you're much more likely to say yes a second time, a third time, a fourth time. And it's particularly true if our first request is relatively small. That's the whole premise of the commitment and consistency principle. Once we say yes, we like to be consistent when future opportunities arise. And we often are consistent without giving the matter at hand a huge amount of thought, right? You start to increase the asks each time you get a yes, you're much more likely to get a yes the next time and the next time. And you can build on it and then you can get to the ultimate request, which is, hey, sign up for our service or become a customer. And you're much more likely to get that yes, because once we make a decision, we like to be consistent with it, right? We don't like to flip flop. We don't like to go back on our previous behavior. We like to remain consistent, with the decisions that we made, with the actions that we took.
I love this. You're such a wealth and encyclopedic amount of information on this great topic. Thank you so much for joining me today. Remind our listeners how they can get in contact with you and learn more about your work.
Oh, Charles, thank you so much. It's been a complete pleasure. You are, such a knowledgeable host, man. You put me through my paces. So I totally, totally enjoyed this. People can connect with me on LinkedIn or on Facebook. They can find my book, Using Behavioral Science and Marketing, at Amazon or KoganPage.com, really any place fine books are sold. I am the Chief Creative Officer of HBT Marketing. HBT stands for Human Behavior Triggers. You can find us at hbt.mk or hbtmktg.com. We shorten marketing. And I'd love to hear from any of your listeners if they have follow-up questions or they just want to chat or connect. That would be great.
Wonderful. Thank you again for joining me. Thank all of you for listening. And we've just reframed how to see your customer, not as a rational decision maker, but as a human navigating emotion, loss, shortcuts, and stories, which raises an uncomfortable question. Is your marketing underperforming because you need more budget, or maybe because you're working against how the brain actually decides? Nancy's conversation with me and her work leaves us with that simple challenge. Pick one principle and treat the next 30 days as an experiment. Turn it into evidence. Test your old approach against a behaviorally informed one and let the results do the convincing. Thank you for joining us. I hope this episode has provided you with valuable insights. If it has, I ask you to share it with someone who would also benefit from it. If you've been enjoying and gaining knowledge from this podcast, then subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can find all the previous episodes of the podcast and additional learning resources. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple or Spotify and leave up to a 5-star review.